when Britain entered the war in August of 1914, First World War, they were woefully ill-prepared to go to war. They had no stock of ammunitions or anything like that. And in fact, by 1915, the stock was seriously running short, and we were actually buying ammunitions from Canada. And this almost brought the government down. It was a real crisis. It became known as a shelves crisis. So Herbert Asquith, who was the Prime Minister at the time, and he was a local man, he came from Morley near Leeds, he appointed David Lloyd George as Minister of Munitions. And the decision was made to build several munitions factories throughout the UK. These two guys were in London at the time when all these discussions were going on. This is Honourable Rupert Beckett and Sir Algernon Firth. And they were businessmen from Leeds. So they got wind of what the government were planning. So they came back to Leeds and they got together with a lot of other industrialists from Leeds and put together a proposal for the government that a munitions factory should be built in Leeds, which was a good proposal because Leeds was a large industrial city. And this is Sir John McLaren, who was, again, an industrialist in Leeds. And he set up the Leeds National Shell Board. And initially he was involved in converting Kirkstall Forge to do munitions, and also then Newley Forge. But the shell factory at Barnbow was the first purpose-built shell factory. So the decision to build at Barnbow was because there was nobody living down there. There were two farms in the area, both of which remain today, although one of them isn't a farm anymore. But there was no general population because the 1875 Explosives Act said that if you were building munitions, it had to be somewhere where it wasn't populated. So it was built on land between the two farms, Layscroft and Shippen. It was the largest munitions factory in Leeds. In fact, it was the largest in Europe when it was built. And it consisted of 8 blocks of assembly rooms made up of 56 working rooms. And the reason it was designed like that, the rooms all were separate, was so that if there was a problem, if there was an explosion, it would be contained in one area. So they were actually wooden buildings, generally wooden buildings. They had, brick foundations, but generally wooden buildings so that they would easily collapse if anything happened. The land was belonged to the Gascoigne family of Gascoignes of Lotherton Hall. And as I say, it was a huge site. It was a 400-acre site. So they set about recruiting to make people for working at Barnbow. And this is a recruiting poster. 130,000 people came to the recruiting office to try and get jobs at Barnbow. Initially, they took on about 20,000 people, and mainly women, because the men were away at the front. And the initial 50 employees went down to London, to Woolwich Arsenal, to be trained, and then they came back to Leeds and trained the rest of the staff. The women came from all walks of life, domestic service, retail, a lot of women who'd never worked outside the home before. But they all had the same intention to support the war effort and support the men who were at the front. The money was good. That was another incentive. Basic salary was 28 shillings a week, but the average salary was between £2 and £3. And those who were working in the most dangerous areas of the factory, in the actual shell filling part, could earn up to £10 a week, which was phenomenal for those days. They worked 12-hour days. They worked 3 shifts of 8 hours. But on a Sunday, they worked 2 shifts of 12 hours, which meant that they could have, every third week, you could have a day's holiday. And that was the only time they got off. They didn't have any week's holiday or anything like that. They got every third Sunday off. So this is a look at the map of where the site was. At the bottom you can see there's the railway line. This is the North Eastern Railway from Leeds to York and Selby. And there was a spur that came off it for Barnbow, at the Barnbow Halt, which had 2 800-foot platforms. Above that is where they stored the finished ammunition in magazines. Where you see A, that's where they filled the shells with cordite, because the shells contained cordite and amatol. So A is where they filled the cordite, B is where they filled the amatol. The amatol factory, which is where they made the explosive that went into the shells. Originally they were going to build the amatol factory at Otley, but then they decided to tag it on to Barnbow. But there were two separate factories, and they were kept very separate because the amatol was really dangerous. There was an internal railway system as well, which was for transporting goods in the raw materials and the finished shells out back to the main line. And there was also another narrow gauge railway that was in the factory, which was it was pulled by ponies, traps pulled by ponies. So this is the amatol site, and this is where they made the explosives that they filled the shells with. Barnbow was an experimental factory, and so they were making amatol. Most of the shells in the First World War were filled with Luddite, but here they made amatol, and that's what they filled the shells with here. Amatol was more dangerous than Luddite, actually. It's a mixture of TNT and ammonium nitrate, and it is more explosive. This factory and the shell filling factory were kept, although they were on the same site and next to each other, they were kept completely separate because the amatol factory was really dangerous. So here we've got an outside shot of the shell filling factory in March of 1916. This is only sort of 5 or 6 months after the beginning of the building. They started building in the August, September, and within 6 months it was mostly up and running. So we can see one of the sheds, they call them sheds, but one of the workrooms with the domed roofs. The roof had a shiny material on it so that it looked like water from the air in case the airships came over, which they did on occasion. But they never actually found Barnbow, so they didn't actually cause any problems. This is the boiler house. There were 3 boiler houses. They had to provide the central heating system, but also the hot water for the laundries because the girls had all their dresses laundered at the factory. So this is the laundry, garages, and this is the internal railway station, north and south stores. So raw goods coming out on one side, completed shells on the other side to go to the front. And they went directly down to the front from Barnbow. So at its height, the workforce was between 17 and 19,000, of which 93% of them were women and girls, because the men were at the front. When they introduced a different working pattern, when they introduced a bonus system, the workforce was considerably reduced, mainly because some of the women couldn't keep up with the pattern that they were expected to work. So they did go down to about 9,000 from the rest of the war. The total weekly output of shells was between 300 and 400,000. As I've said, it had its own railway system, which was linked to the NER line, and 38 special trains and 15 ordinary trains round the clock went into Barnbow. 1,500 tonnes of goods were moved from the factory every day. The factory was guarded by both male and female guards. So this is one of the entry boxes. This is the one that was near Lazencroft Farm. The girls were searched when they were coming onto the site because they weren't allowed to have matches or cigarettes or metal buttons on their clothes. They had to wear rubber-soled shoes. So, and they were not allowed to bring anything that could cause an explosion onto the site. And this is the internal railway system, the internal station with manager Tom Bell. Women came not only from Leeds, but from areas like Castleford and York. Quite a few people came from York and Harrogate, and they got either subsidised travel or free travel on the railway, and I'm not sure which it was, but they certainly got subsidised travel if they didn't get free travel. So we're going to look at life in the factory now. We've got a few shots of internal shots of the factory. I don't pretend to know what all of the processes are that the girls are doing, but it was a hard life. The work was hard, it was dirty, it was dangerous. But the girls developed a very good camaraderie between themselves. They used to sing as they were working. They weren't above writing little notes on the shells. Some of them were rude. And certainly a popular one was, "I hope this shell blows the Kaiser to hell." And you can understand why they wanted to do that. They also wrote the names and addresses. And sometimes the soldiers at the front, wrote back, and penfriendship developed. So it's good. The girls could be quite boisterous. They were working hard. They were also playing hard. There are stories, anecdotal stories, of things that happened. Like, for example, there was a man who was in a carriage on the Leeds to York train, which was occupied by several Barnbow ladies, and by the time the train pulled into York, he had been debagged. So they worked hard, they played hard, they had a kind of seize the day attitude. I'm going to read you a poem now. It was written by a Munitions lady, but not one from Barnbow. But I think that the sentiments that she expresses are exactly the same that the ladies at Barnbow would have felt. Earning high wages? Yes, £5 a week. A woman too, mind you. I calls that dim sweet. You're asking some questions, but bless you, here goes. I spend the whole racket on good times and clothes. Me saving? Elijah, you do think I'm mad. I'm acting the lady, and I ain't living bad. We're all here today, mate, tomorrow perhaps dead, if fate tumbles on us and blows up our shed. Afraid? Are you kidding? We've money to spend. Years back I wore tatters. Now it's silk stockings, me friend. I've bracelets and jewellery, rings envied by friends, a sergeant to swank with, and something to lend. I drive out in taxis, do theatres in style. And this is my verdict, it's jolly worthwhile. Worthwhile for tomorrow, if I'm blown to the sky, I'll have repaid me wages in death and passed by. So we're going to look at some pictures of the Barnbow lasses, the girls who worked there. You may notice about in this picture that some of the ladies have got puttees on their legs, that kind of things that the soldiers wore. And that was to prevent the chemicals getting onto the legs. Some of them wore trousers, but it was a powder, it could go over the trousers and get onto the legs. But if they had the puttees on, that did protect the legs. This is another photograph of several Barnbow ladies. We don't have the names of all of them. We don't know all of the people who worked there. We do know these two ladies at the far end. This is Isabella and Alice Smith. And these are mother and daughter who worked there. There was a lot of that, quite a lot of family members working together, groups of sisters, mothers and daughters, aunts and nieces. And you'll notice they've got the greatcoats on. And can you see the badge that they have? This was issued by the government to the girls who were working in munitions to show that they were involved in the war work. And it says on war service. And it was also the badge that the government issued to men who were in reserved occupations who weren't at the front. And this was because of the people who gave white feathers to the men who weren't at the front. So in order to prevent them getting the white feathers, they were issued with this badge. Now here's another lovely photograph of some Barnbow workers, and it's got some men on it, which is quite unusual. And it's a really unusual photograph is this, because you remember what I've said about them being searched when they went onto the site, that they weren't allowed matches, they weren't allowed cigarettes, they weren't allowed metal combs. Here's a man with a cigarette in his mouth. How he blatantly allowed himself to be photographed on that, I don't know. This is a photograph taken at Christmas. It must have been in one of the canteens because you can see that they've got paper streamers from the roofs. So they wouldn't have been allowed to have those in any of the working rooms. So I think this would have been from the canteen. Barnbow had its own fire crew, and it consisted of 30 ladies and one man who was in charge. He'd come from London. The ladies were drawn from the rest of the factory staff. You could apply to join the fire brigade if you wanted to. They weren't just there to put out fires. Also chemical spillages, because you know, the chemicals were extremely dangerous and could cause TNT poisoning, which it did in quite a few occasions, and deaths. There were at least 4 deaths from TNT poisoning at Barnbow. There may have been more, but we know of 4. And even if it didn't cause death, it could be really unpleasant. The faces swelled up so that they couldn't see, caused nausea. They also, although I don't think they knew this at the time, it also made some of them infertile. So TNT poisoning was a very great hazard. The management at Barnbow were very conscious that they had to look after the welfare of their staff. They knew that they were relying on these women, and although in the First World War I think the soldiers were regarded as expendable, that wasn't the case with the munitions workers. They were looked after. So the site had 3 canteens, one for the majority of the main workers, one for the men, that was a bit sexist, but they did have one for men, and one for the amateur workers, because they had to be kept totally separate from the rest of the people. In fact, they even had guards with red dresses on standing outside the entrance to the amateur canteen to make sure that anyone who wasn't working in the amateur factory could get into it. And this is one of the canteen kitchens. They had all of the very latest equipment, the latest ovens and so on. They got a lot of the supplies from the next door farm, from Shipham Farm. Shipham Farm had a herd of 130 cows, which supplied milk every day to the factory. And the girls were encouraged to drink the milk because they thought it was an antidote to the TNT poisoning, as they thought barley water as well, lemon barley water. But whether either of those worked, I don't know, but that's what they thought. And they also got a lot of vegetables from the farm, and the farm had its own abattoir. So they were very well served in terms of the diet, probably much better than the rest of the people in Leeds during the war. They also had doctors' surgeries on site and the dentists on site. And this is, of course, is long before the National Health Service, but it was free, which was really a very great boon. Particularly the dentist surgery, because another side effect of working with the chemicals was what they called septic teeth. I assume they just meant decay, but they referred to it as septic teeth. So Barnbow was no stranger to famous visitors. And Winston Churchill came. He was First Lord of the Admiralty at that time, long before he became Prime Minister. And he came, and he really was struck by the ages of some of the women that he saw working there and how slight they were. And he remarked that these sort of slight young girls were doing these really heavy jobs. And in fact, there was a lady that he spoke to, that he met, who was 13 years and 11 months. And really, she shouldn't have been working there. She should have been 14, but she was only a month away of it. And no doubt she'd massaged the truth when she told them her age. And so he was struck by the kind of people who were working there. King George came as well. He came twice. He came once on his own, and he came once with his wife Mary later on. And this is a telegram from Lloyd George congratulating the factory on its production. And it says, "Congratulate your amateur factory operatives from me of fine shell-filling performance last week. Increase of 100%. Magnificent. Thank staff and workers of both factories for splendid results of last few months. Plenty of ammunition saves lives of our brave fellows at the front." And it's signed by Lloyd George. So, the tragedy that happened there. The worst disaster ever to befall Leeds happened on the 5th of December 1916, when an explosion ripped apart Hut 42 and resulted in the death of 35 girls and women. Many more were injured. There were about 150 working in that shed at the time of the explosion, and I don't think that anybody escaped totally unharmed. I mean, if they were not physically injured, they were mentally injured. The scene was horrific. I mean, there were bodies around. There was scalding water because the rooms were heated. The central heating system was overhead pipes in the rafters. They fractured, so there was pouring, scalding water coming down on the ladies, on the women. There was the risk of fire and further explosions. It must have been horrendous. I can't imagine what it was like. Again, there are anecdotal stories of one lady who was decapitated and her head was lodged in the rafters. Another one whose body was lodged in a window frame and wasn't found until the following morning. It was horrendous. I'm going to read you now an eyewitness account of it. This is a lady called Mary Cowell, who she gave this interview to the Evening Post in 1995, so that's nearly 80 years after the explosion, but she did remember it. And she said, "I worked in room 41 shell store, and opposite was room 42. At the bottom of my room, they filled the shells with 2 bags, known as A bag and B bag. The B bag was the larger of the 2. An examiner used to come round to put a gauge on the shell to test it. Then it came to my section. The fuse that was put into the shell was greased at the bottom and then screwed in as far up as it would go. Then our machine did the final tight up. The shells were then put on a trolley to be packed into boxes. My recollection of the accident, which was hushed up, was that it occurred about 10:30 p.m, just after I'd finished my 2 to 10 shift, and we were waiting for the train that took us back from Barnbow to Marsh Lane. There was this terrific bang, and we were told afterwards that the accident had occurred because instead of 1 A bag and 1 B bag being put into a shell, someone had put 2 B bags. The fuse didn't go down sufficiently enough, and the worker who picked up the shell in room 42 put it on the machine and it blew up. It also burst all the hot water pipes above, and many workers got scalded. I went back to work on the same machine, but meantime they'd built sandbags all round for safety purposes. And once I put the shell onto the machine, I was told to take cover behind the sandbags and then only approach the machine to recover the shell after the machine had clicked. The lady, if I remember correctly at my age, who worked on the shell that blew up was called Mrs. Yates. She had 3 children and a husband who had TB and couldn't work. We all collected for the families of our friends who had died or had lost limbs. Now, she's saying it was hushed up, and it was. There was nothing about it in the papers. The girls had all signed the Defence of the Realm, the DORA Act, so they weren't allowed to speak about it. The top brass knew about it, but not generally. Generally, it wasn't known. So that's the actual room that blew up, Hut 42. So when anything like this happens, there's always someone who's a hero. There's always someone who goes above and beyond. And in this case, it was a gentleman called William Parkin. William Parkin was an engineer who worked at the factory, and he was walking past Hut 42 when the explosion occurred. And he went in and out of that room 11 or 12 times, each time bringing a girl out to safety. No thought of his own safety, in and out and bringing girls to safety. He got absolutely no recognition for that at all. Not from the factory management, not from the Leeds Corporation, not from the government or anything. But afterwards, the girls themselves, they collected and bought him a silver watch, which they had inscribed, and his family still have that watch. William Parkin lived quite close. He lived in Austhorpe, and he had been away at the front, but he'd been injured. He'd been injured at the Somme. In fact, he'd been injured twice at the Somme, which is why he was back home and working at Barnbow. But a couple of months after the explosion in February, he actually went back to the front, and he was gassed. But he survived, and he came back to Austhorpe and got married. He had he had 4 children, and he lived a good life. So that was good. So this is a photograph of some of the injured women with their nurses. The girls had paid into a welfare fund You know, they had a deduction from the wages every week for a welfare fund, and they were able to hire Weetwood Hall as a convalescent home. It's now a pub and a hotel in that. It's on the ring road around Leeds, and so a lot of the girls went to Weetwood Hall to recuperate, and it wasn't only girls that had been involved in the explosion. They used it for recuperation for people who had been, you know, for example, with TNT poisoning. So a lot of them went there, and some of them went to the infirmary as well, you know. So I've said that it was a hushed up. Nothing was in the papers. Even the death notices for the girls didn't say that it'd been the cause, but they'd be by an explosion. So it said things like sudden death or as the result of an accident, but it didn't mention that it had been an accident or an explosion at a shell filling factory. Although the death certificates did. The death certificates did say that it had been the result of an explosion. So we're going to look at some of the people who were involved in the explosion. We haven't got details of all of the women, we haven't got all of the photographs, but you know, we've got a few. So this is Edith and Agnes Sykes. They were sisters who worked there. Edith was the elder of the two, and Agnes was the elder of the two. Yeah, Edith wasn't actually old enough to have been working there, because although they could go to work at 14, they couldn't actually work in the shell filling bit until they were 18, and she was only 15. So she had, you know, she'd obviously lied about her age when she went there. And on the night of the explosion, you get it right, Agnes had the flu. So she was due to go on shift, but she had the flu, so she didn't go to work. And Edith went in to do her shift. So she shouldn't have even been there. And she was involved in the explosion. And she didn't die on the night, but she did die about 3 weeks later at, you know, in hospital. So this is a picture of Edith, 1901 to 1916. There were no big fancy funerals held for these girls because it was hushed up, it was kept under wraps. But actually her brother was a soldier at York, at Strensel, and he brought a gun carriage, and they actually took her coffin to the gun carriage, you know, from her home to the Hunslet Cemetery. This is Agnes. She never really recovered from this. I think she probably was what we would now call survivor's guilt. You know, she suffered from that. I mean, she did go back to work. She married. She had children. She wasn't very robust. She did die quite young. She was only in her middle age when she died, and I think that she obviously lived with what had happened for the rest of her life. We've got a few pictures of ladies from York who were involved in the explosion as well. This is Mary Elizabeth Wortley, who was from York. The reason she'd ended up working at Barnbow was because her husband had been given a white feather. Now he had gone to sign up, and for some reason he was refused. So he wasn't at the front. He wasn't a soldier, but he had been given a white feather in the town. So to show that the family were supporting the war effort and that they were patriotic, Mary decided to go and work in munitions, and she came to work at Barnbow. She had 10 children. She left 10 children. And her husband walked from York to Barnbow, which is 20 miles, I think, something like that, 20 miles to identify her body. And apparently they gave him a cup of tea and a bun then and sent him home. This is Elizabeth Mason. She was 41 years old when she died. She lived in Rose Street in York. She was survived by her husband and 5 children, 4 of them under the age of 14, and the eldest was 16. Gertrude Reed, 27 when she died. She came from Staffordshire, but she was living in York at the time. Her husband, Private George Reed, was actually a prisoner of war in Germany at the time of the explosion. And he'd been injured in the Battle of Mons. Mary Carter, she was only 23 years old. Her husband was Lance Corporal Carter. She had a child of 2 years old, and her brother was serving in France at the time of the accident. She had worked at the chocolate factory. She'd worked at Roundtree's in York before she went to work at Barnbow. This is Eliza Grant. The one standing up is Eliza Grant. The one sitting is next to her sister. She's another one who shouldn't have been in the factory on that night. She was very friendly with a lady called Edith Levitt. And Edith Levitt was due on shift. Eliza Grant wasn't due on shift, but Edith talked her into going to work with her. And apparently, Eliza had said, if I get my housework finished, I'll come with you and I'll go to work. And the two ladies were caught up in the explosion, literally as they were coming through the door into the shed. And again, Eliza left 9 children. This lady's called Jane Sparrow. She was a supervisor at the factory and she was very well liked by the girls. They used to buy her birthday presents and Christmas presents, and she looked after a lot of the injured. On the night, she wasn't actually involved in the explosion, but she did look after the injured on the night. And then afterwards she visited survivors in hospital and she visited survivors at home, some of them for several months. And she actually did get some recognition from the management. They actually gave her a dressing jacket to say thank you for what she'd done. I don't know if any of you know this name, Leonora Coyne, if you've heard of her. She was a suffragette, quite a famous suffragette from Leeds, actually. And she didn't work at Barnbow, but she did work in another munitions factory in Leeds. She worked at Leeds Forge. When war broke out, Emmeline Pankhurst had words with the Prime Minister, Herbert Asquith, and she said that the suffragettes would cease all their operations for the duration of the war, and she would actively encourage suffragettes to support the war effort. So Leonora went to work at Leeds Forge, which was another munitions factory. And she was quite well off, was Leonora. Her husband had a jewellery business in town, jewellery and watchmaking. And she set up a fund to provide comforts and prosthetic limbs and things like that for the women who'd been involved in the accident. There were 2 further explosions where sadly another 5 lives were lost. In March of 1917, 2 girls were killed, and in May of 1918, 3 men were killed. There was an accident in the mixing shed. As it happened, George V was visiting Leeds that day. He wasn't at the factory, he was at another factory. But he heard about the explosion and he telephoned Barnbow to express his condolences, and his wife Mary actually sent flowers to the survivors and to the wives of the men who were killed. And this is the Roll of Honour, which contains the names of all the 40 people, men and women, who lost their lives during the war at Barnbow. And this is a photograph taken on Armistice Day. They don't look very happy, but I think, they'd had 4 years of war to cope with, and at least half the workforce had lost somebody during that war. They'd lost the husband or the brother or the boyfriend. So it must have been a bittersweet moment. The management didn't know what to do when the armistice was announced, but the girls did. They just went out. They went out down into town to join the celebrations. They went into Cross Gates to join the celebrations. And some of them didn't come back. But a skeleton staff came back in order to close down the factory. And it did cease production almost immediately. It's not like after the Second World War when things carried on, because we had the Cold War, of course. At that time, production ceased almost immediately. And they used the factory as a depot for war materials that had been left over. And they stored quite a lot of war materials there, including engines, which had not been used, steam engines. And the women got no recognition whatsoever for what they'd done, basically. they got this little card, it's about the size of a postcard, which said, so-and-so worked at Barnbow during the war. And that was it. Nothing. 4 years out of their lives, lives lost, nothing. So some statistics. 36 million, over 36 million breech loading cartridges were completed. Nearly 25 million shells were filled. And the tonnage of finished ammunition which shipped overseas was 566,000 tonnes. 15% of all the shells that were fired, all the British shells that were fired in World War I were actually filled at Barnbow. It was a very significant factory. So, as I've said, at the end of the war, it was taken over by the War Department as for storing surplus munitions. And in 1924, they got rid of all this material, and the site was sold, and they sold it to the Garforth Mining Company, Garforth Colliery Company. And the last of the original buildings were demolished in 1933. A lot of people think that the ROF Barnbow, which was at the other, which was during the World War II, and which was at the other end of Manston Lane, was on the same site, but it wasn't. The sites were about a half-mile apart. The site from the First World War had been completely demolished and gone by the time the Second World War started. So, although they both had the same name, they were not on the same site. And this is it today. It has gone back completely to nature, and it's looked after now by Historic England, who scheduled it as a monument in 2016, 100 years after the explosion. And that means it is totally protected. Nobody can build on it. Nobody can go and dig on it to find archaeology or anything like that. It is completely protected. And the reason it is because it is unique. It's the only surviving site of a World War munitions factory in England. So, as a society, we have been researching this story for about 20 odd years. And we have, in a local park, we have now a memorial to the Barnbow girls. This was put there in 2012, and we had great fun doing it. We went to Bob and I went to a quarry to select the stone to put there, and then somebody from City Council actually designed the plaque. And as a lasting memorial to the Barnbow girls, every year we hold a competition for the schools, for local school children, to design the flower bed that surrounds the memorial. So that's a way of helping children to remember this story. And also, on the site of the Second World War factory, ROF Barnbow, which ceased production in 1999, it's a housing development now. And we approached the developers and said, would they name the roads on this housing development after the victims of the Barnbow factory shell explosion? And they've done so. Haven't used all of the names. They haven't used all 40 names because there aren't 40 roads in this development. But quite a lot of the names have been used. So that is another remembrance of what these women did. And as I said, it's now a scheduled monument, and nobody can touch it, nobody can harm it. That's the memorial to the Barnbow girls. Thank you.